Hi everyone, and welcome to the 5th Internally Screening podcast. My name's Adam.
I'm Rupert.
And today we're going to be discussing a couple of films. First of all, we'll dive into probably the biggest blockbuster of this year, given the year we've had. Christopher Nolan's Tenet, which is, I guess, it had an unusually high amount of stakes pinned upon it in terms of its release. Given that it's basically the only blockbuster that's come out so far this year, outside of the films that released in sort of January, February time. And it's basically had the entire hopes and dreams of the cinematic world pinned upon it to see whether or not the movie industry can survive in a pandemic. And unfortunately, even though it did pretty well considering the circumstances, grossing around $330 million worldwide in the middle of a pandemic, it still managed to scare off the rest of the movie world into releasing their films onto streaming services instead. Story-wise, it's hard to get into much without entirely spoiling huge portions of it, because to me it was a film so veiled in mystery when it was sort of first teased, and even its later trailers don't really reveal a huge amount about it. I guess I'll hand it to you, Rupert. What's your takeaway from this?
It's like maybe the first time in, I can't even remember, like the last time I walked out of a cinema as confused as I was after seeing this, because this film kind of, I knew what to expect. I'd heard all of the reports of how confusing it was in terms of its structure and its plot points and the concepts presented, and how deafening it is at the same time, all kind of making it into one kind of just absolutely like cacophonous experience in every way. And it still kind of took me for a ride. I'll say in terms of entertainment, I thought it was very entertaining, but I'm not entirely convinced that it's actually that good as far as it is in terms. I don't think it's a very necessarily well told story, whereas it is very clearly well directed, well made, and for the most part well acted. In terms of, there's a lot of technical virtuosity on display by Christopher Nolan. Obviously, like his absolute aversion to using CGI of any form kind of makes him just inherently refreshing to watch in the current sort of Hollywood landscape. I loved the soundtrack, and there's like specific portions of this film that are just like amazing, but I can't help but feel like its muddled nature is kind of to its own detriment, because I look at something like Memento or Inception, two films that are both structurally very, very complex, or at least more complex than your normal Hollywood big blow things up type film. And while both those films were confusing to me on a first watch when I first saw them, I got like a very clear emotional through line, and I could easily understand and digest the themes and the ideas that were presented by them. But with Tenet, I understood parts of it, had no fucking idea what was going on in other parts of it, and I didn't really necessarily get a very consistent or interesting through line with it. And it was mostly just kind of a spectacle to me. A spectacle that I enjoyed, but not one that I'm particularly keen to revisit.
I think I've come away with it with a pretty different takeaway, but I do acknowledge a lot of the, issues you take with it. Particularly, you brought up the sort of lack of emotional resonance in the film, and I think that's one of its key things it suffers from. Something in the wake of this, I've read reviews that have criticised Nolan throughout his career for not having enough in the way of emotional resonance with his characters, but I think that's an unfair assessment.
I've never agreed with that until this.
I don't know how you could levy that at films like Inception, where like the main character is so bogged down by his own personal trauma. It's like the main crux of the whole film. It's the thing that keeps him going.
And Interstellar.
In Interstellar, The Prestige is all about revenge and remorse. Here, we have very much a blank canvas as our main character. In fact, Christopher Nolan went so far as to call him the protagonist, which I'm sure some people could read into and say, oh wow, that's actually like there's something kind of really deep and mysterious about it. But to me, it just reads as like 15-year-old like English lit student who thinks he's being super deep. Like, I think the naming of him as the protagonist hints at the wider issue that he doesn't really have a distinct character. And that's not to say that John David Washington doesn't do a really great performance. I think he is super charismatic in the role. He takes to it like it has a kind of James Bond-esque quality where he's kind of cracking a mystery, sort of talking his way out situations, getting into fights, but being really suave and charismatic the whole way through. But in terms of his own motivations and what drives him through the story, there's nothing really there. There's very little. The most emotional resonance I would say you get out of this film is Elizabeth Debicki's character, who, not to spoil it too much, but her son is kind of essentially held captive, or she is in a position where she is at risk of losing her son. And that's a driving force for her that then kind of rubs off a bit on John David Washington, because he forms a bond with Elizabeth's character. So there's that and not a whole lot else.
Yeah, I mean, I did enjoy, again, without spoiling anything, I did enjoy the final reveal that was going on with Elizabeth Debicki's character. I thought that was pretty cleverly done.
Yes, yeah.
And there's certain scenes with her in that certainly were like emotional. Yeah, because like I was saying, I've never agreed with the whole characterization of Christopher Nolan being this cold, precise, emotionless filmmaker. Because if anything, like, to me, his films are overly sentimental.
Right.
And not necessarily to a detriment. This, to me, like, I mean, I also I read something about Christopher Nolan which I couldn't have put it better, but I'm going to steal it here, and that's that Christopher Nolan isn't really the kind of director who's interested in one perfect shot. Like, most of the things he shoots are just like very functional. He gets a shot of a car or a person doing something, right, and it's more about the way he edits them together and has multiple threads doing multiple things at once.
Yeah.
And the way he layers them. So, you know, I could think of like the scene in The Dark Knight where you have all of the judges being assassinated, or, you know, the entire premise of Memento, where you're moving forwards and backwards at the same time. Where this, to me, like, for a start, it never had the central premise of it was just never. It was never as compelling to me as something like Inception, which is like a very concept-heavy film. But the concept of it was so intriguing. The concept of this film it's cool, but it's also very, very confusing and not as cool as something like Inception, or even like individual set pieces of Interstellar. For, like, you know, if I think of Interstellar, I immediately think of the docking sequence, or I think of the bit where they're on the planet with the black hole that's warping time. You know, those are really, really cool concepts that Christopher Nolan does in an interesting way. This, to me, apart from the fact the film is essentially like a snake eating its own tail,
right?
It only kind of reveals itself at the end of the film, at which point I've just been kind of overwhelmed with all of the strange things that I'm seeing, and I don't know.
There's
it's
a lot
bit
of sensory overload. I mean, like you say, I mean, it starts with the booming like score that drowns out all this important expository dialogue, because without that dialogue, you have no bloody clue what's actually going on in the film at all. And so you're trying to decode it with, you know, in the cinema screen, no subtitles whatsoever.
The gunshots, like, I could feel them.
Yeah, I mean,
it was so loud.
The sound design is great. It's just like it swallows everything.
The sound design is great. The sound mixing is terrible.
Yeah, there's one particularly egregious scene where they're, for some unknown reason, doing like a little boat race, like on catamarans. You can't hear anything because they're talking to each other over headsets. So you've got like the crackly headset noise, the deafening noise of the water, and also like this really high wind going on in the background as well. And it's like a really important point of understanding our villain and all the sort of characters' relationships to one another, all their goals, what is the villain trying to achieve, and it just fucking can't hear it.
That film was that was the almost exact point where the film lost me.
Right. I think also continuing the idea of sensory overload is this kind of the film kind of more than feeling like a character-driven story feels a lot like almost a scientific exercise that Nolan came up with in the writing process of what if this could happen? What would the story around that be? Rather than it being what would a character in this situation do, it's how would this scientific concept work? And I think therein lies the intrigue, but also the issues. And on my first watch of this film, I've only seen it twice, but the first watch I was constantly trying to unravel what I'd seen the previous scene. So when I was I was almost unable to properly take in what I was being told, the information I was being given in the next scene. And so it became really difficult to kind of hold all these thoughts in your head. You're also trying to unpick the physics of the situation. How is this possible? How did this character do this? Why does it? Hang on. How does it work if one character's doing this and the other character's doing that? You find yourself constantly asking questions in your head, but the movie is, carrying on regardless. It's almost as amazing of a scale that the film has, and as necessary as it is to see in the cinema. It almost benefits from being on streaming, so you can pause it every 5 minutes and just elaborate, just sort of sit down and get out a notepad and go, okay, so this character's done this now. This character's
and
done
subtitles would have been nice for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're kind of just constantly juggling each idea that the film presents to you, and I feel like the film is gonna anger a lot of people because they're gonna be like, this film is making me feel stupid and I hate it. But I definitely got this. I think a character in the film literally says, "Don't think about it, feel it," or something to that extent, right? The scientist character at the beginning. I think.
Yes, yeah.
And I feel like that's kind of Christopher Nolan just speaking directly to you.
Kind of.
I don't think the film is trying to make people feel stupid. I'm not even sure the film does even make sense.
If anything, what I would say is the film is desperately trying to make this incredibly complicated idea digestible. I think that's why it's framed as it ultimately outside of its incredibly complicated physics, it's a pretty basic action film with a pretty basic setup and premise. There's a kind of spy mystery at the beginning. We need to work out who the bad guy is. We find out who our bad guy is. He has an evil plot. We have to stop the evil plot. There's a bunch of big action set pieces with the biggest at the end. Our heroes win, spoiler, and everyone goes home happy. It's essentially that film. You could tidy up a lot of the complicated elements of it, and it would be the next Mission Impossible film. You know what I mean? I feel like it's Nolan's coked up sort of scientific fever dream Mission Impossible entry, if you like.
There's always been talk about, Nolan's always talked about how he loves James Bond films.
Right.
And there's always been rumours about, will Christopher Nolan direct the next James Bond film? So I kind of feel like this is him getting that out of his system, because aesthetically this film is, it's part science fiction, but I'd say most of it is just spy thriller, espionage film, very much in the vein of something like James Bond, where you have a lot of very attractive characters going from place to place, doing ridiculous things like crashing planes or bungee jumping up a building, which was kind of cool. Yeah, the aesthetic did kind of, while I enjoyed seeing it, people in suits doing cool spy stuff, there were points where the film kind of felt like it has a lot of that super serious Nolan tone as well, where it's kind of big blaring music, everything is very serious and very important. And normally he's kind of able to infuse a level of humour in with that at points. I can think of moments throughout his films where he has done that. For me, it felt more confused tonally in terms of what it was trying to do. Right. I don't know why that is, or it's because it's kind of because when you're talking about tone with a film, you're kind of talking about how a film makes you feel. It's kind of hard for me to put my finger on what it was. Something just felt not quite tuned right, if that makes sense.
I guess so. I guess if I was to say that the feeling I came away from this film was kind of awe. Like, I mean, it's not something that Nolan fails to do, but this film particularly felt massive. It felt like some of his largest scale set pieces and like design work and orchestration that he'd ever done, and that's saying something with the filmography that he has, which is it was all very impressive. I think something that you mentioned earlier about sort of comparing it to films like Interstellar and Inception and how impactful those films were, was that at the beginning of those films you kind of have a clear idea of what the stakes are and where the characters are, what issues our characters face and where they've got to go. And with this one, it's kind of so constantly sort of unraveling and revealing itself that you only really fully understand the true stakes of the film right towards the end, right before the final set piece. You know, in your average James Bond film, you kind of, James Bond is given his mission at the beginning of the film. He's like, this is your mission and this is what happens if you fuck it up, right? In this film, and I appreciate why they did it, because the story, I don't mind the mysterious element of the film, but in it kind of having this complicated forwards, backwards time element to it, it masks its own intent to the audience. I think that can bring about sort of more negative reactions because it makes it harder to digest. But on a different note, what do you make of the performances in this film?
I kind of have mixed to positive feelings about the performances. Honestly, in terms of past Nolan films, I have a pretty high standard because he has gotten really amazing performances out of actors before. He obviously did something quite minimalist with Dunkirk, but if you look at Interstellar, that, you know, Matthew McConaughey is like on another level in that film. Obviously, like the Batman films, he put together some of like the most iconic ensemble casts of villains and heroes.
Absolutely.
And you know, I can't think of many films that he's done where the acting isn't phenomenal. And while I thought the acting was good in this, I didn't think anybody was great. Like Elizabeth Debicki was stand out by far and away the best part of the cast for me in terms of performance. John David Washington I thought was pretty good. He has like the charisma and the suave, but it kind of felt like he was over animated at points. I can't quite put my finger on what it was. I know he's a very good actor because he was in Black Klansman, which I loved, and I thought he was much better in that. Maybe he was just better cast.
I'm wondering if maybe some of those issues come from the fact that his character has very little substance to him.
So I can't imagine he got great direction.
I feel like
being the protagonist.
I feel like something I sort of touched on earlier was that the only characterization he really gets is through John David Washington's performance. You know, like through being charismatic, being kind of cheeky in certain situations, and then dead serious in others. Like it's pretty boilerplate spy, but it has a lot of charm to it, and I think that's all it's all that Nolan gave him, really.
Well, his physical performance is great. Like, he's all the action stuff he does really well in. Like, there's some hand-to-hand fight scenes which he was excellent in, and I know he did a lot of his own stunts, which is really impressive. Robert Pattinson I thought was again cool, but his character didn't really have anything to him until the final part of the film.
Again, I
feel like on rewatch maybe you get more from it, because I've only seen this once.
Yeah, I mean, it is an important film to kind of understand what's happening in the film all the way through, because on a second watch, because there is this kind of dual forwards backwards relationship with time, knowing how the film ends is kind of almost crucial to how the film starts. With regards to Robert Pattinson's performance, I would say pretty much the same thing about John David Washington, in that he didn't have much to work with and does the best basically by himself with just the dialogue, just pure dialogue, to get him through and characterize his own performance. So I think on that level, I think he did a really good job.
Yeah, that's fair. I mean, I didn't hate him in this film or anything. I do understand that his character was made bland on purpose. So he only could do so much, I guess. There was something. He wasn't ever distracting. I wasn't particularly involved in his character. It's kind of, I guess it's just personal preference. It's hard for me to say.
No, I understand that, yeah.
I'll also mention that I thought Kenneth Branagh was pretty good to pretty bad, and it kind of depended on what scene he was in.
It absolutely did, yeah.
He had the worst lines in the film, which certainly doesn't help. But he also, bless him, he is a theatre kid at heart. He was loving every spicy bit of dialogue he got to say, and like, I don't know.
He hammed it up to absolute extremes in certain points. Branagh can act really well when he wants to, but he's so dedicated to hamming it up wherever he can. And he plays a Russian in this film, and I don't know, you know, Westerners doing Russian accents has varying levels of success, we'll put it that way. It can go from just...
a trend he continues.
Yeah, it can be
He is
kind of
delivering that
times.
sort of Nolan exposition like it's a fucking Shakespeare monologue at points.
Yeah.
It is kind of unintentionally funny at points.
Yeah, he is definitely the weakest actor involved, or weakest performance. But, like you say, I think he's also been given some of the worst dialogue. So, and you know what? Probably some of the worst dialogue in any Nolan film I can think of in recent memory. Just for his character, at least.
Yeah, there was a lot of... I mean, Chris Nolan's never been about subtlety. And people always complain about the amount of exposition in Inception. But with Inception, that did actually have pretty solid characterization throughout. There's only like a few... There's maybe like... The only character in Inception that I don't really give a shit about is Joseph Gordon-Levitt.
Yeah.
But he's still cool. So I don't know why he made such a great job of the characterization and the character arcs in Inception, and just kind of seemed to not really try here. At least, you know, this is my first impression.
Yeah.
Do you want to get into spoilers? Like, I feel like there's not much... I don't have much to say about it, because this film is so weird. This film reminds me of fucking Primer, which is a film someone made in his garage for like $5,000. A guy called Shane Carruth. It's like the most confusing film ever, and that's kind of the point of it. It's just like, oh, time travel is really difficult to understand, and this film feels like Primer. So I don't know if I have much to say on the spoilers, because I still can't really get my head around what actually happened. Right.
Well, we'll dip into it. We'll have a little dive. We'll see what we can scrounge around. We'll put the time codes in the description. Should pop up on the thing. So if you don't want to hear any spoilers about Tenet, if you've avoided it or are trying to avoid any spoilers, then yeah, just click to the next section.
And keep being responsible. Don't go to the cinema.
Right, so we'll get into it then. Basically, the core premise of the film, the concept is that there is, in the future, developed technology that allows people to invert their entropy, and in doing so, you reverse how you go through time. So essentially, you can time travel, but to everyone else, it looks like you're walking backwards. It's not as simple as like you go into a time machine and you appear again. You appear like 6 months in the past. You go into the time machine. You have to then reverse 6 months to get back to that point, and then you go into a different time machine and start again. Our villain, Kenneth Branagh's villain, Andre something stereotypical.
Isn't he called like Psycho?
No,
Saito?
You know what? That was something Sator, and you know what? That's actually something I looked into. Well, happened upon on the Wikipedia page of all things. I know, trashy, but there's apparently there's like a famous Sator Square, which is like a famous like palindrome carved out into stone, and it says Sator Arepo Tenet Opera Rotas. And so the beginning of the film takes place in an opera house. Our lead villain is called Sator, and the film is the organization within the film is known as Tenet. So I don't know where Christopher Nolan found that shit, but that's very influenced these things. But anyway, Andre Sator, played by Kenneth Branagh, discovers in an old Soviet city at the fall of the Soviet Union basically a piece of this device that allows you to I guess I'm getting ahead of myself. Fuck. That's the problem this film does.
You're trying to describe it in chronological order.
I am. That's my problem.
I don't know if there is a chronological order.
Let me double back on myself a bit. Basically,
or if such a thing even exists.
Basically, our villain has access to this time travel technology. So there's like bullets that can go backwards because they've been through the time machine. Whilst our protagonists are trying to work out where do these things come from, who has got them, that brings him to our villain. Working backwards, it's revealed that in the future they developed this technology, but there's also a machine, as they refer to it as an algorithm. If you basically have all the parts of this algorithm that assemble this weird like tube thing that they have, you can essentially invert the entropy of the entire world. Or rather the entire universe, not just everything inside the machine, but everything outside of this tube thing. And so the villain's grand plan is to essentially destroy the world, destroy reality as we know it. And the reason for that is because our character, our villain, has terminal cancer, and it's kind of a big fuck you to the world.
It's supposed to sort of relate to how he won't let his wife leave him, right?
Yes.
It's like, if I can't have you, no one can.
Yes, which is often,
and it's also like this technology. The reason it exists in the current universe that you're observing in Tenet is because future humans created it and sent it back. Because whatever has happened in the future is just so dreadful. They're saying, well, if we send stuff back in time, if someone blows up the universe, then we don't have to suffer now.
Right. Yes. Yeah. Exactly that.
So that's what I got from it.
In a way, there's a kind of almost meta climate change kind of commentary going on. Although it's so buried in amongst this scientific gobbledygook that it loses its effect if that was its intention.
Well, this is my problem. The threat is so impersonal. You know.
Yeah. It's not really directed at.
It's very intangible.
Involved. Right.
Like, the great thing about Inception is it used this like massive concept idea, which allowed for all these crazy set pieces and great like character moments, and used such a massive idea to express something very personal, because what they're trying to do is implant an idea in someone's mind. So that works really well for me, because it's like, wow, a cool idea, and then it's really all about the characters from that point. Whereas this, it's all of the characters are like in service of the idea.
Yes, I 100% agree with that. I guess where me and your enjoyments of the film kind of differ is that I wouldn't necessarily say I had to see it a second. Well, no, I would say you have to see it a second time to kind of get head or tail of it. But yeah. I think I enjoyed it more than you even after a first watch. I think on an action level, as a kind of a cinematic exercise, if you like, it is one of the most grandiose and sort of like audacious, aspirational.
It's very
like,
daring. Yeah.
It aims for such ridiculous heights, and in terms of its action and presentation, I think it succeeds. I mean, there's some amazing set pieces in this film. One that was sort of teased in the run up to the film was the thing where they crash a plane into and that's without even all this time stuff. That's just Nolan being weird and just going, fuck it, I just want to crash a plane for the good of this story. But that then leads into an amazing fight between our protagonist going forwards in time and versus himself going backwards in time.
Yeah.
But then it's them trying to like predict each other's moves and react, and it's bizarre, but the choreography is insane. Like, to be able to construct that, I have no idea how you could possibly. You'd need fucking NASA to write that fucking bit of script. I honestly don't understand how they could come up with something, not just something that like that bonkers, but making it work and making it like actually gripping and not just really silly. Because that's the danger as well. When you have something so high concept, you end up just coming away with something just really that if it failed, it would just look ridiculous.
Yeah, I mean, despite the fact I only kind of enjoy this like a little bit, like I do think this is a good film, like a decent film overall. Every single technical element of it, apart from the sound mixing, I think is like very, very admirable and there's a bunch of I love the backwards bungee jump, and like you said, the corridor fight scene is great. Airplane bit is great. The final battle is like a fucking mess, but it's pretty cool. Yeah, you know, there's a lot. Oh, and the car chase was probably my favorite bit, actually.
Oh yeah, that's another great bit.
I didn't really the film had kind of lost me by that point, so I wasn't entirely sure what was going on. But that sort of mid portion of the film, where you've kind of reached a turning point, was kind of where I was most engaged and most enjoying it.
Yeah.
Even though it was baffling to me as I was watching it, in my head I've kind of made better sense of it. But I'm sure I'll watch it again and realise I'm wrong. But yeah, like the thing is with this film, it's like I do appreciate a lot about it, and I think it's amazing that Christopher Nolan made this, wrote this, and made this, and thought this was the film that was going to save cinema from COVID.
Yeah, this is just too bonkers to do that shit. Yeah.
Like, he has absolutely lost his mind if he thought this was going to save cinema.
Yeah.
You know, I've got nothing but respect for him as a filmmaker. It's good, but it's not totally for me. I'd give it like a 6 out of 10.
Okay. I mean, this is definitely Christopher Nolan's most impenetrable film. So I think it'll be a big turn-off for someone who's looking just for like a more straightforward action blast. That even his previous work like Inception, you can still come away from that understanding like what's gone on, regardless of like the high concept stuff. I mean, we haven't even gone into some of the amazing bits like the final set piece. There's one amazing shot where they blow up the midsection of a building, it reverses, it comes back together, and then the top of the building explodes. I don't know how the fuck you could film that.
That bit was again. I was like,
mind.
wow, it looks cool, but I was like trying to think about the mechanics of it, and I was like, I was like, yeah, it looks really cool, but then in my head, I couldn't appreciate it in the moment because I was just like, but if it's here and then this happens, you know, it was, you know, that was my problem the whole film is I'm too stupid for it. I'm lagging behind. I'm like a fat man jogging after like a Ferrari that's just kind of patiently waiting for me, but it's forever out of reach.
I mean, it could be genius that Christopher Nolan's designed a film you do have to watch twice. Maybe that's why he was hoping that it would save cinema, because it's like, if everyone has to see my film 2 or 3 times, then I'm making buck.
That's a genius marketing move.
Yeah.
I mean, look, I'm fine with films being confusing. Like I said, I really like Primer, and that doesn't make any sense on a first watch, at least. It's very, very obtuse and wordy, just like this. But for whatever reason, it worked in that film's favour. Like the theme of the film, it kind of works into that. Whereas with this film, because it's so mechanically focused around the mechanics of the film, understanding it to a point feels like that is where a good portion of your enjoyment should be coming from. Right. Because I'm not getting that. It wasn't quite clicking with me. Although I did enjoy it. So.
I can't really disagree with you on any of the points you've brought up, because they are inherent issues with the film. But I think it's issues I myself have kind of come to resolve largely. Whilst it is frustrating that there isn't much in the way of emotional resonance, I would like to see more of it, and the film would have been better with it. Just the ridiculous scale of this film, the presentation, each action set piece was phenomenal and super creative and interesting. Like having a car chase go one way and then it gets interrupted by a car chase going the opposite direction, reversing through time. That's fantastic. At the end of it all, I personally think this is probably one of the most satisfying films I've seen all year. Not that there's been many to pick from. Obviously, it's a small pool of films. But I'd probably settle on an 8 out of 10 for this. After a first watch, it was probably only a 7. A very mild, confused 7. And second watch, especially watching it with friends that were kind of more invested in, you know, Nolan and his filmography. Just watching you guys go kind of nuts trying to decode it, and I was just sitting there going, okay, this is brilliant. It was almost more fun watching you guys get confused by it.
I was so sure I had it, and then you know, that fucking weird boat scene, and then the car chase happened with the fucking reversey portals, and I was like, nope, haven't got a fucking clue what's going on now.
So there we are, I guess. 6 out of 10 and an 8 out of 10. So I mean, I guess I would heartily recommend this film. Like, there's no
I'd still recommend
There's
it.
very few films like this in the world.
Like I said, I'm not that keen to rewatch it. I will definitely rewatch it. And I did. 6 out of 10 is a positive rating to me. So
yeah.
Like I think it is like good. My enthusiasm is lacking because I have such a high opinion of Chris Nolan, Daddy Nolan, and I want to love everything that he puts out. And this just didn't quite do it for me.
On the contrary of that, if you want to watch one of the most creative, bizarre action films of ever, maybe straight up, like one of the most unique action films you could ever watch, just prepare to scratch your head a few times and read up a billion physics books and IMDb reviews that decode what's going on, because it'll probably help.
Okay, so for this episode, I recommended Adam a film. That film is Cure from 1997. It's a Japanese horror film. It kind of came out just before, if not just about, the beginning of the J-horror boom that was really big in the early 2000s and late 90s. Kind of better known films from that genre you've probably heard of would be stuff like Ju-on the Grudge or Ringu, all that kind of stuff. A lot of stuff that got kind of cannibalized by hack American directors to make worse versions of,
right?
With white people in, so people would go and see them. You've probably seen one of those, and this to me is definitely in the genre, but it's also very distinct from a lot of those films in a lot of ways that we'll probably get into. And it's easily my favourite of the ones that I've seen from this genre of J-horror, which is has kind of fallen from relevance now, but it was at a time very cutting edge. And at the time, this film was, as far as I'm aware, one of the sort of first experiences Western audiences had of J-horror. It did quite well on the festival circuit, and Kiyoshi Kurosawa, the guy who directed it, is one of the more prolific and critically acclaimed directors from that genre. He's got a lot of classics in a lot of different genres as well. He's kind of like a less insane Takashi Miike. Takashi Miike obviously did Audition in '99, which is again kind of closer to this than other J-horror films in some ways, but it's also way more goofy. But this film is kind of unlike many other horror films. It's way less focused on scares and jumps, though it kind of has both at the same time. It's very, very atmospheric, incredibly gloomy, but like a lot of J-horror films, I guess quite concept driven. So what did you think of Cure, Adam?
Well, I don't want to oversell it, but having never heard of this film, not knowing anything about it, this has already become one of my favourite films of all time. And I don't say that lightly.
Fuck yeah.
Because, I mean, I might be somewhat less cynical and picky than you, but I think it's a trait we do both share. I think it's a trait that lots of, cinema enthusiasts share. Trying to avoid the word cinephile for Rupert.
I'm glad you didn't say that.
I fucked it there, though. Anyway, Cure is, like you say, so atmospherically dense. Some may think of it as too slow moving, but it builds towards its grand conclusion, and it adds layers to its mystery so effectively. It's so psychologically horrifying. Like, I guess the notion of a psychological horror is nothing particularly new, but the way this film taps into that kind of horror is so specific.
It's so like affecting as well. Like you can call some stuff psychological films in the characters within the films are confronted with like psychological concepts.
Yeah.
But this to me, like it literally like induces like an existential crisis just watching it.
Yeah.
Like it's so upfront. It's almost purely psychological. And there's like a kind of supernatural element to it, but
a potentially supernatural element, because it's almost, there are moments in the film where it is implied that it might be supernatural, but it's never confirmed. And in that kind of grey area, there's almost more horror in the idea that if something is inexplicable, we jump to the paranormal. And this film almost kind of entertains the idea that actually the paranormal is just that. It's just a coping mechanism, and the horrors you see here are very real and very possible. Even though there is some suspension of disbelief required to get over one of the core aspects of the film in order to find it, I guess, truly horrifying. But for me, it's not something I had a problem with at all, and I think the film does a great job of explaining its components in a satisfying way that kind of adds to the thrill and the mystery of it, whilst also kind of getting the audience used to the idea that this is the path this film is taking. You're not going to get hit with like a left hook of like, oh, it was a spooky ghost the whole time. It ain't doing any M. Night Shyamalan type twists. It's if anything, the fact that you're sort of, you're headed towards this kind of inevitable conclusion is what makes it so horrifying. You don't know exactly where the film's going, but the film doesn't stray off course. It's very straight down the line. I guess without trying to say too much about what happens. Do you reckon it's too much of a spoiler to divulge the concept?
Well, this is why I've kind of tried to hold off in my introduction of it, saying what it's about. But if you don't want spoilers, basically, some murders are happening wherein people are committing murders, but have no memory of them, and seem to immediately regret them and are traumatized by the fact that they have committed murder. And all of these murders in Japan have been linked to have one defining element to them, which is that each victim has had an X cut into their throat, which is obviously quite a bizarre occurrence trend to be happening in any crime. And it's kind of about this detective who is trying to solve it and is very, very stubbornly trying to figure out a logical explanation for this like seemingly illogical phenomenon. The core I'm not saying the one of the core concepts of the film, just because if you do want to watch this film, I'd just recommend just go and watch it if that sounds interesting to you, because watching it naturally unravel is one of the best parts of it, even though this is a fairly early reveal. So should we just put the spoiler warning there, because it's kind of impossible to discuss a lot of the elements of this film.
I guess to really hammer home how much you should watch this film, I think Japanese horror has a very unique atmosphere to it that American and Western horrors, British horrors, they have their own charm as well, but I would definitely say that Japanese horror is some of the most affecting in the genre that I've ever seen. And there's I think something super eerie about the way they tell those stories. There's really amazing performances in this film. The way the mystery unfolds is it's very incremental with the amount of information it gives you. But like as the film pieces it together, you yourself piece it together. It's so satisfying and yet so uneasy and eerie to watch. There's barely any score in this film. There's loads of like elements of the sound design in a shot will suddenly blend into like this horrible droning note that kind of
I'm glad you mentioned the sound design. The sound design is just amazing.
It almost reminded me of
it's actually probably the best sound design of any film.
It's fantastic.
I've ever seen.
It almost reminded me of the intro to Eraserhead, which is the only part of Eraserhead I've seen, because we watched it very late at night. It had just this droning cacophony of like industrial like noise and field recordings and stuff like that, and it was just too much for me at the time. And this film kind of hinted at that in terms of the way sound design was constructed. So yeah, if you want to watch a super affecting, detailed, captivating horror story, please watch this film and then come back, because we're going to spoil the shit out of it.
So the central premise that we didn't mention is that essentially we're introduced to this character, Mamiya, who seems to have amnesia himself and is kind of like a lone wandering figure. And the way he's introduced, just to immediately go into a small detail, the way he's introduced is one of the best scenes in the film. It's very, very eerie. So we were just talking about the sound design. You're on a beach, and throughout the film, there's always this kind of like ambient whirring from something happening, whether you're in someone's apartment and there's like a dishwasher going, or you're in the streets and there's cars. But on this scene, you're on the beach and it's very windy and it's really weird. So there's someone on the beach looking, you see a shot of a sand dune, cuts back to the person looking, and then another shot and the guy is just kind of there. So there is almost that kind of hint at him being like a almost maybe pseudo supernatural force. Like the way he appears in the film is literally like kind of unnatural,
kind of ghostly.
He's just exactly. And he has this ability. The film sort of shows that he has this ability to influence people to kind of regress to their id. You know, they kind of lose all elements of their ego and super ego, and they just kind of do something primal without thinking about it.
Right.
That maybe is locked in some sort of deep part of their unconscious. And he convinces this guy to kill his wife, although he never ever directly says it. It's very strange. Like, there are conversations on this film that are very sort of circular, where it will be someone talking to this character and they're just kind of cycling through this kind of seemingly meaningless, repetitive dialogue.
Right. Yes.
And it's very, very eerie, because you kind of get the gist of what's going on here. The way he uses certain tics like his lighter or water to induce people into this state. And as you're watching it, you can kind of feel yourself like almost being hypnotized into this kind of weird kind of mind space where you just feel like very deeply uncomfortable, but also you can't look away. I don't know if you kind of got the
100%.
same effect.
And what, 100%. And what was brilliant about it is, like you say, the first scene he's introduced is incredibly settling. The man who he meets on the beach is perplexed by him, takes him back to his house. And in that first interaction where they're just talking together in his home, you get the impression of, like, you don't know for sure what's going on. If you don't know perhaps if Mamiya is going to be the next murderer, or if he's going to be the person that then convinces this man to murder, which it then turns out to be. But in that moment of uncertainty, we are trying to piece what's happening here? Why are these characters talking, and why do I feel so frightened right now? Then he kind of, it's clever in the way it kind of cuts around the full extent of their conversation, and then each time he convinces a new character to do something, you hear more of what is said and more of the conversation becomes apparent. And it seems that basically all he does is kind of essentially interviews his victims, and when they let slip a valuable bit of information, he kind of pounces upon it. And the fact that he has amnesia is almost kind of his in. It's like he is unassuming and unthreatening and basically stonewalls people. There's bits where he's being interviewed by the police later in the film, and no one can get through to him. Initially, not even our main character, the detective. But it is then later established that the detective, because he kind of leads a dual life of work and at home, where he's looking after his sort of mentally unwell wife, that he is kind of in a perfect place mentally to understand and almost reciprocate what Mamiya is doing on like this hypnotic level. There's some fantastic sort of just details. Like, he doesn't ever ask anyone to kill someone else. Like, there's a scene with the nurse where he's in the hospital.
That scene is so good.
That's probably that's like a pivotal scene in terms of understanding his character and his motivations. He's in the hospital because the police have caught him and have put him under psychiatric evaluation, essentially. And whilst he's in being evaluated, he turns it on this nurse. The conversation basically leads to him saying, "You wish you were a surgeon, didn't you?" And she's just kind of staring at the floor, staring at the water he's spilled. Somehow that has this hypnotic force on her. And then he says, "You'd like to cut someone up, wouldn't you?" And then she just gets up. Next scene we see of her, she's in like a public men's bathroom, just cutting, like just hacking a dude
someone's
to death.
face off.
Yeah. Oh shit! I forgot about that. She's straight up.
She like peels.
Oh,
it's like the most gory moment of the film.
Oh my god! That scene I forgot about that. Christ.
That scene is so good, man. Because the way it's edited is amazing. Like, it's almost a lot of the film. The film is kind of composed out of long takes for the most part. The camera just kind of laterally tracking the characters, or just, you know, staying completely stationary. If it's not doing that. And that scene, it's got some, it does that for the beginning of their conversation, but while it's quite unassuming. Yeah, it is a very pivotal scene, like you said, because this is almost as close as you come to Mamiya giving you any element of backstory himself. He says, "All the things that used to be inside of me now they're all outside, so I can see all the things inside of you.
Right.
Which a lot of the characters kind of come up with hypotheses of what he could have been, or where he came from, and it's never fully confirmed or anything like that. And then as he spills the water, there's like a hard cut. The woman's looking down at the water, and as she looks back up, you get this kind of snap, like second long shot where she's about to look back up, and he's got his hand on her head and just says, "Don't look."
Yeah.
And then he has that strange kind of monologue where he's talking about, you wanted to be a surgeon because you wanted to cut open a man, and then the first time you did surgery, it was the first time you'd ever seen a man naked. This is because you have this deep-seated hatred for men.
Right, because you've been oppressed for being like a female doctor, a female like medical professional, like
because he baits her out because he's like, you're a doctor, but you're only a woman.
He exploits her weakness, and then in doing that leads her to like this seemingly logical conclusion based on that weakness. And I guess that's the kind of frightening part, is that by the time the character is done being hypnotized, murdering someone seems logical. And that's a line that's used in the film often, is people will just say, oh, it just seemed like the right thing to do at the time. Like when they have no memory of being hypnotized, they just go, oh yeah, like it felt right. It felt what I should do.
It's amazing because this film, I feel like hypnosis is like inherently kind of a very hammy idea. Like in real life, it's very, I don't even know if I believe in hypnosis in real life in general. And the way this film presents it is just like completely convincing. Yeah. Not only because the film itself is kind of lulling you into hypnosis with this kind of almost soothing but still unsettling like ambient noise that's just constantly going, and these weird like cycling conversations. There's like never a point in this film where I felt like I was taken, like my immersion was ruined at any point. And I guess another thing to touch on is just like how good all of the acting in this film is. Because the guy who plays Mamiya, he is genuinely terrifying. And as far as I'm aware, he's not even really an actor. I looked him up. He's like a musician.
Oh, is he? Oh, that's sick. Okay. That's always wild when you get like an actor that just turns up for like a genre-defining performance and then just buggers off and does whatever.
Yeah,
it's amazing.
It's amazing.
That is amazing. Just coming back briefly to like the humming, droning soundtrack. You brought it up with like machines in houses and things that kind of contribute to the noise, like diegetic noise then forms into soundtrack very subtly. There's a constant thing in his house, in our detective's house, where the wife keeps turning on the washing machine. The washing machine makes this horrible rumble, but like this kind of low, bassy kind of frequency that's just kind of there. And then when he sometimes he'll go and turn it off, and then there's this moment of like eerie calm, and then it will turn back on again in like a few seconds. I just thought that was a wonderful detail.
I guess the ambient noise is also like, the film it takes like a very statedly objective view of what's going on. Like it kind of seems to reject the idea, or at least that's at least how I kind of read it. I could see it does kind of merge into the detective's viewpoint at points in the film, but I think the whole premise of the film is like the central horror of the film. Whereas most horror films seem to have the core horror of the film being a character's trauma in some way, right? This film is like the core horror of the film is that you can never truly know another person, and you only know that you exist. The film is like, it has like an absolute complete lack of empathy for anything, because I feel the film's take on empathy, judging from what happens in the film, is that it's kind of just like a blunt tool of just projecting your own interpretation of someone else onto you, right? Like, because the core horrifying concept of the film is someone kind of getting into your head, and rearranging your wants and needs into essentially something more pure and less built up by your ego. It's kind of hard to put into words, because what I'm trying to say is basically the film is perfectly assembled, because the way it's shot and like the ambient noise is kind of constantly reminding you that you're watching a film, but at the same time it's kind of like lulling you into this false sense of security and unnerving you. And it's just like a constant jarring sense of like nothing is quite fitting, but everything is working at the same time. It's that contradiction that makes this film like so deeply uncomfortable.
And I think
in a great way.
And I think to build on that, it's like in American films, it's about overcoming the horror. And in this film, it's about succumbing to the horror.
Yeah, exactly.
It's not that you can beat something. It's that this is an element of human nature that is being unmasked. And that's why it's so crucial that normal people, like random people who have no criminal past, do this same crime, because it's an evil. Like I think it was described by someone, I read something somewhere. Not that there are evil people, but that people do evil things, and that evil is in actions and motivations. Because even Mamiya, like you say, kind of, it's almost more like a primal thing that he does. It's not so much that he's getting people to kill because he has a bloodlust that he wants people dead. None of the people he kills matter to him in any way, really.
He's so scary.
What he cares about is exposing the human condition, is what I gather from it. And that seems to be why he kind of taunts our lead detective, because our lead detective seems so more able than most to avoid this kind of temptation. And so that's why he's such a great character insert for the audience, is that you feel like you could be as strong as he is. You know, the film describes the fact that his unique sort of situation between work life and family life is what makes him so hardened, because he essentially isn't one personality, he is kind of two personalities. And it makes him harder to hypnotize, because you're kind of trying to hypnotize two people at the same time. He shows a strength and a willingness to, but also a willingness to understand what's going on that so many other characters don't. And you're sort of urging him to beat this evil, but you kind of know he can't. And the end of the film is super eerie and not that I've said that 100 times already, but it leaves it on this really bizarre and uncomfortable note, where it appears that nothing's really changed. Our villain of the piece seems to be dead, but the actions that he sort of set in motion keep happening. And potentially our lead character is now responsible for them, depending on how you read the ending. I don't know how you read the ending.
I mean, I was just going to say, I think the reason Mamiya is so terrifying as like a threat is because he seems to have no motivation whatsoever. Typically in a horror film, a scary villain is someone who's like, you know, you think of like in Halloween, what's his name?
Mike Myers.
Guy with Mike Myers, he's just really strong and he'll never stop. You know, that is scary.
Sorry, is he Michael Myers? He's Michael Myers in that. Mike Myers is Shrek.
Right, Mike Myers is Shrek, yeah. And Austin Powers. Yeah. You know, he's a horror in his own way. But but yeah, like the idea, so that's scary. So but the inverse of it is almost more terrifying. Like there's nothing uber competent or strong or he doesn't even really have any motivation. From what we see, he just kind of wanders around. And it's kind of implied he's not even really a person, because he says all the things that used to be inside of me are now on the outside. Because it's kind of implied that he perhaps made himself a vessel for this bizarre power that he holds, right? So
he's like a missionary almost.
Yeah, he's almost like he says, in fact they do say that, don't they? They say something about him being a missionary. I think that is literally mentioned. Right. Yeah, he's kind of just like this unknowing agent who has this like insane amount of power over whoever he speaks to, but doesn't really seem to know or particularly care. He's just kind of going from point to point. There are like later scenes where it's kind of revealed that he might have because he does kind of reveal that he doesn't have amnesia to the detective when the police are trying to interrogate him.
Right, yeah, it's like selective. Or what something he says that's interesting to our detective is, only you can hear me speak. And exactly. It's not, I think it's a more of a metaphor, but it's like perhaps there is something more to it, that like everyone else just hears this confused amnesiac who couldn't possibly be guilty of these things because he has no clue where he is. He's just a befuddled fool. And our detective knows there's more at play. It almost seems throughout the film that Mamiya is trying to convert our detective to becoming like the next missionary, you know, to like follow in his footsteps or join whatever movement he is kind of unveiling.
Well, I guess that kind of affects the interpretation of the ending, because as you said, the reason the film sort of seems to pose the reason the detective is less affected by Mamiya's kind of suggestive powers is that I think it's kind of implied that he used to have two sides to him, right? The side he had with his wife and the side he had with his work life. And, you know, generally people think of themselves as, you know, I have my work self and then I have my actual self. But his obsession with his job has essentially eroded his real self into just like a kind of caricature. Like, you know, when he's having dialogue with his wife, and it's kind of cringy in a way. It's like,
it doesn't feel real.
We're gonna go on holiday. Oh yeah, it feels
and
like
also,
super awkward.
to add to that, because actually this isn't an element I'd actually properly picked up on, or at least like fully come to that conclusion. But it makes sense that there's a couple times they get on buses together. And it's like the background, there's no like buildings or anything. It's just like fog or like clouds. It looks like they're like flying through the air on like, it like almost looks surreal. Like,
I think that was partially like religious imagery, which I was kind of picking up on because this is the second time I've watched it. And I thought that might have been. Perhaps
there's a kind of like fairy tale, like sort of unreality to it where, like you say, if he's like playing a caricature of himself in his, you know, home real life, that when he gets on the bus with his wife and when he's like sort of doing things with her, there's like a slight unreal edge to it where it's like it's an act, and it becomes more like blatantly an act to the viewer. I don't know if that's like looking too deeply into that.
Well, I don't know. I was gonna say, so the whole thing with his wife is that like all of the interactions with his wife have basically become his job.
Right. Yeah.
And he is essentially, much like it's implied Mamiya did, made himself like a vessel where like a real version of him doesn't really exist anymore because of the situation he's in. And then major spoiler here, you know, when he kills Mamiya and he kind of holds his hand up and does the sort of cross symbol that we also see on that footage, that's kind of supposed to symbolize him kind of passing it over to him,
right?
In a way, that's how I read into it. And yeah, the bus thing is really interesting to me because this film is mostly tonally like very gritty and realistic,
super realistic,
but it has these moments of kind of like super gritty and realistic with these long takes that you can't look away from, right? The camera is literally just forcing you into this space and it feels almost claustrophobic. But then it does have these random breaks where like there'll be like purposeful continuity errors. Like there's the bit where the detective is walking and you hear the kind of the traffic lights or something going like ding, ding,
oh, the
ding,
level
ding.
crossing,
yeah, the level crossing, that's right. Then it has this super quick montage where it's like you're seeing animals in cages and also shots from further on in the film just kind of mixed up.
Yeah.
And there's sort of like this moment of like unreality that seems to just kind of spike through the film that's just previously been super realistic. And then there's a bit, because at the beginning of the film you see the guy and it's got that kind of one of the few bits of music in the film with the guy kind of cheerfully walking through this underpass, and then he kills
that's such a great
prostitute.
opener. Just like
Yeah.
bizarre.
Very strange. But then when he's having this moment where there's like this strange montage, there's a shot where you see him in that same underpass looking at the pipe, and the pipe is spilling water out of it. It's kind of like, I guess the implication of that is that he's kind of already succumbing to the hypnosis.
Yeah, the like being in the proximity of this person for this length of time is kind of it's getting to him, but we don't quite know to what extent yet.
Or maybe it's kind of like this is going to sound weird, or maybe now I've just thought about it, maybe it's kind of like Inception. So like the whole point of Inception is that you can't truly like incept an idea, I guess. Like you can't plant an idea in someone's mind unless they already thought they had it.
Right.
So at this point of the film he hadn't met Mamiya, but maybe the point is that just from like having it in his mind, it's kind of like an idea that's been planted by him just from like being in the proximity of it and thinking it, because he's like so susceptible a vessel,
right,
not to succumb to the power but to wield the power.
Yeah, no, that actually does make loads of sense. And that kind of leads to one of my favorite, maybe my favorite scene in the whole movie, is that same kind of sequence of events happens to our main character's companion. He's like a psychiatric evaluator who
he's like a therapist.
He's a psychologist. That's it.
Analysis guy.
He's like he's a criminal psychologist who kind of he talks with throughout the film to try and decode like the mental state of Mamiya. And towards the end of the film, the psychologist gets way too close to it, and they're chatting in the psychologist's apartment. They look over some like old footage of like a really old, like an 1800s hypnotism, where the same act of like drawing an X in the air and like the same result happened, where she killed her son with the same X carved into his throat. And so they're kind of going over this stuff and mulling over the conundrum of what's going on. And then it cuts forward to him back in the apartment of Mamiya, which they go to earlier in the film, which has like loads of like cages, loads of strange apparati, I don't know.
Has like the monkey that's been like twisted.
Yeah, who seems to be like a first victim, like a kind of almost
like twisted into an X,
almost like a test. And he's like looking through the books. He finds the book with like mesmer and like hypnosis and all these different like weird, strange books. And then he finds himself at a barn where he's like he looks into the window, and it's like an old abandoned insane asylum or something. Then he sort of sees this spooky face through the wilderness, and then he imagines himself being murdered in Mamiya's prison cell, but by his friend, the detective. And then suddenly he's
that shot is horrifying as
where
well,
he just
comes out of the dark.
He just walks towards him, and like there's no physical suggestion of violence, but like this horrible sense of dread and like what's gonna happen when he reaches him. And then he like snaps out of it. He's like, oh shit, I'm still back in the apartment. But the amount of time where before we kind of get a flash of unreality and then we're back. Here we're immersed in it for minutes before we realize, oh my god, we're still here. And my favorite shot in the film, and I love it when any film does this, any horror film particularly, he gets up, he's like, oh man, nah, I need some rest, or like, oh, I'm letting this get into my head, like I need to stop thinking about this for a sec. He walks over to the next room, the camera very calmly sort of pans across. Our detective is in the foreground looking at the TV, and in the back there is a fucking massive black X painted on the wall. Just after we've thought, oh, this guy's safe from his mind, he's come out of his little moment, we see the X, and there's just that horrifying silence of like knowing his fate, you know?
The reveal as well, that fucking image of him just like trying to scratch the X off of the wall.
Yeah.
When the guy's like, what's that, is horrifying. And then it's revealed he is like one of the few characters in the film, because I guess another one of the core horrors of the film is like a loss of agency.
Yes.
The idea that you're doing something that you don't have any control over. Or like, what do you have control over if you don't know what your mind is actually thinking? Because we all know we have a subconscious and an unconscious mind. Like, do we have any real agency? Like, it's actually impossible for us to really know that, beyond like really superficial, like, oh, of course I have agency, look, I just moved my hand.
Right.
Like, we don't actually know, you know, where do our thoughts come from? And this guy, somehow he does manage to take agency over himself, but he does that by he cuffs himself to like a piece of
a ceiling pipe or something, like a water pipe.
Because he knows he's gonna get the urge to go and like murder someone, because he's a psychologist who understands this weird phenomenon that they've been investigating, and he like kills himself. And the use of violence in this film is so sparing but just like so effective. Like we were talking about that shot of the woman peeling a man's face off, or the opening murder where a man just beats a woman to death with a pipe.
I love how
I love
like, how it's done to that cheery music, by the way. I know we mentioned it earlier, but that's such a weird way to open this film, because there's like barely any music in the entire film after that, apart from this like ambience.
I guess the aesthetic of the film is quite minimalist in a way. Like there's, in terms of colours, like everything's very grey and sort of faded green and dark blue. And there's a lot of scenes, like the scene where the detective first encounters Mamiya, he's in this abandoned hospital. Like urban Japan in this film kind of looks like a desolate wasteland. It looks almost post-apocalyptic, and they're in this kind of like seemingly like abandoned hospital, and he's talking to Mamiya, and it's literally pitch black, and the actor is moving around, and you can see his face in certain beams of light. And there's one thing I really appreciate about a horror film is obviously it works into the theme of this film of, you know, being in the dark and not knowing something, because, you know, that's why we're scared of the dark, is the fact that there could be something there that we can't see.
Yeah.
And this film is actually willing to like actually shoot people in the dark, because there's so many other horror films that will be in the dark, and by that they'll mean it will be the middle of the day and they've put like a blue filter
day
on,
to
right?
night, yeah, day for night.
Like this film is genuinely just like pitch black and just really shadowy, and like it's almost, I guess, probably natural lighting for a lot of it. But I mean, it looks horrible, but it looks kind of beautiful at the same time.
I was gonna say it's an impressively beautiful film for how miserable and grotesque it is, but like it's wonderfully shot. Like the cinematography is really great because it captures what it needs to, but it frames it in like a really, it's surprising how dynamic it can be just to have a shot be static, just letting that characters move through it. It feels like you're really, I don't know, it almost feels like a kind of scientific observation of what's happening, rather than like the sort of shaky cam sort of horror that we've come to expect from more Western type horror films, I guess.
Yeah, well, I guess the main comparison a lot of people make to this film is Seven by David Fincher, which I guess came out 2 years before this, and it is kind of similar in a lot of ways. It's very Fincher-esque to just hold a static shot if it just works for what it is. But what Fincher will normally do is he'll, you know, cut it with a lot of things. You know, he's a very sort of cut back type director, sort of very unpretentious, presenting bits of information to you. Whereas the way Kurosawa directs this is it lets you look at something and it won't let you look away from it, and you're kind of picking up new things, and the camera might move, you know, forwards and backwards or follow a character around. It's kind of letting you just constantly read it, and the way it forces you to kind of observe time pass kind of almost naturally, as if, like, you know, because when you're watching a film with cut back, there's an element of like continuity where you can read that, you know, maybe you're not watching it in exact real time, whereas this film, like, it's really forcing you into this concept, into this overall atmosphere that it's presenting to you.
Yeah.
And it is just like completely inescapable, and it makes me filled with dread.
Yeah.
Every fucking time.
Absolutely. But in the best way possible.
Oh yeah, like I couldn't recommend this film enough.
Yeah.
Like if you're not sold on wanting to watch this film, Martin Scorsese said it's one of the most horrifying films he's ever seen, and Bong Joon-ho has listed it as one of his favourite films of all time.
Yeah,
so,
and it's supposedly a massive inspiration for Memories of Murder, which is also a fantastic sort of horror come thriller type film.
Yeah, like if our expert opinion isn't enough, then surely you've got to listen to
then
them.
Maybe you'll listen to
like,
B-listers like Scorsese.
Bong Joon-ho, Best Picture winner. Yeah, Cure is a 10 out of 10.
I couldn't agree more. Yeah. Straight up.
That's wonderful. I did rate it a 9 on my first watch, and rewatching it, I'm not really sure what I was thinking.
I can't fault it in any way, honestly.
I'm very glad you enjoyed it.
It was a fantastic recommendation.
But, you know, it's Halloween.
I'd never heard of it, and I had no idea what to expect. I was like, oh, Rupert's recommended something no one's ever bloody heard of, probably. This is going to get no views. I mean, it's not going to get any views anyway, but that's by the by. And I watched it. It's fantastic, and you know, I'm super grateful for it. So I appreciate you. Thank you.
Good shit. Right, it's your turn to recommend.
Right.
Sonny Jim.
Well, I am going to recommend the basic polar opposite of this film, and I think the first film in our retrospectives that I've actually seen myself. I want us to return to Peter Jackson's mid-noughties opus that is King Kong.
I thought you might be doing this one. And, I'm very keen to rewatch this. Yeah.
Because this film's interesting to me because it was one that at the time was beloved by everyone. To my memory, I mean, I was quite young at the time, about sort of 10 or 11, I think. But I loved it. My family loved it. Everyone I talked to loved it. The criticism I heard of it was mostly positive. I think it did pretty well. Like it was everywhere for like a couple of years. It was just all people talked about, seemingly, and then it vanished from the public consciousness.
It is one of those films where I just remember it exists every now and again.
Yeah.
I'm like, oh.
It's really strange that such a huge film in its moment just sort of then vanished from everyone's thoughts. You know, no one really cared beyond that.
It was also the thing that he did after Lord of the Rings, right?
Which he's basically done nothing since, apart from the horrible Hobbit trilogy. But he was borderline coerced into doing that stuff. So,
well, he did the Lovely Bones as well.
Yeah, no one cares about that. So yeah, I think it'd be really intriguing to return to that film and see, like, what did young Adam take for high art back in the day.
Yeah, no, I'm interested. That film scared the shit out of me back in the day.
Yeah.
So, if you wanna hear us talk about some horrible modern film and a seminal classic like Peter Jackson's King Kong, give it a rewatch, and we'll be chatting about it at length. I'm excited to see Adrian Brody's sweet face on screen, because I don't get to see him very much in anything really.
That's true.
Smash like, subscribe.
Oh, come on, have a bit more enthusiasm, Rupert.
Press like, please.
Oh, please take pity on us. Someone watch this. No one's watched this to the end. Jacob, I know you've watched it to the end. You're the only one that does.